Hey everyone, today we are going to be taking a look at the Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition book, Player's Options, Heroes of the Feywild. We'll look at every page together, I will give my thoughts along the way, and I would love to hear what you have to say about this book down in the comments. If you'd like a copy of this book for yourself, I will put some links down in the description where you can pick up a PDF or physical copy. This book was released on November 15th, 2011. It was the second of 3 Player's Options books to be released. I'll cover the other ones in separate videos. The book is 160 pages long. The front cover features artwork by Emra El Masli, while the art on the back cover is by Eric Belle-Isle. This book is divided into 5 chapters and is focused on providing additional options for players that want to build a character that comes from the Feywild. It includes 3 new playable races plus 3 new subclasses for barbarians, bards, druids, and wizards. There's also a bunch of information about the Feywild so that you can build a nice backstory for your character. The interesting thing for me is that in 2010, Wizards released 2 books that provided details for specific races, Dragonborn and Tieflings. We started getting these books in 2011, and rather than focusing on specific races, they focused on a region and introduced multiple new races and class options that you could use. I'm not sure if this was by design all along or if those race splat books did not perform as well as they had hoped, and so they went in a different direction with it. One noticeable difference from these 2 approaches is that these player options books include a lot more information and a lot more mechanics than the other books contained. If you know any more about the history of these books, I would love to hear about that down in the comments. If you enjoy these videos, please click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comments what other D&D 4th edition books you would like me to do a page through video for. But let's get started. The first section of the book is called Into the Bright, and this section kind of paints a picture of the journey into the Feywild. It's set in the Nenter Vale for the purposes of this book, but it could easily be moved anywhere that you want to use it. This section contains a lot of flowery language that you would expect from Fey creatures. It tells a story of the scent that draws you off the road and into the Feywild area. The sidebar tells the history of the elves, where there were initially 3 elf siblings. The younger sister revolted against the others and started a war. Eventually, she was defeated and driven off along with her followers into the underground to become the first drow. The older sister and the middle brother eventually went their separate ways as well, and this is essentially the origin story for the Eladrin, the elves, and the drow. The map on the facing page is the Feywild and includes all the locations that will be covered later on in the book. Welcome to the Feywild contains a lot of great information about the Feywild and provides wonderful ideas that you can use to build the backstory for your characters that originate from these lands. It's described as being a magical place and is also referred to as the Land of Fairy. It's filled with dangers from both evil creatures but also some Fey creatures that simply don't understand that their powers are different from those of mortals, and the mortals might get caught in the middle of that. The outsider's perspective describes how mortals from the world view the Feywild. This would be people who have never actually been to the Feywild but are relying on stories that they've heard and legends and folklore. One take on it is that it's believed to be a land of enchantment where dreams can come true. It has a lot of magic, it's got beauty, it's got adventure, and time can stand still in some cases. Others view it as a land fraught with peril. In this case, it's difficult to understand. There's a lot of dangerous creatures, and they've heard of conflicts between the Fey creatures where the mortals end up getting caught in the middle. A couple other views are that it's seen as a storybook land where the plants and trees can communicate with each other. Another one is that it's a land of unknowns where the seasons don't always occur at the same time and day and night isn't as clearly defined as it is in the natural world. The Feywild's native perspective is where it goes into more detail about all of the locations in the Feywild. It covers a lot of the locations such as the 3 Eladrin cities and offers detailed descriptions for someone that is familiar with these locations. The Feycross hamlets sound much like villages you might find in the Shire. It's rural locations with farms where the residents are comfortable plowing their fields and enjoying nature and being with the land rather than any desire to seek adventure outside. The Feydark is much like the Underdark except that the magic is more fantastical and the creatures are much more dangerous. And then we get into the 3 Eladrin cities that are covered in this book. The first is Astrazalian. It has crystal stone towers. It's known as the City of Starlight, and it's controlled by a lot of strong noble houses. And then Mithrandain is the city that grows high above the trees and is really the center of art and culture within this world. Shinalestra is a city that is in a constant struggle to survive because it sits at the border between the Feywild and the Feydark, and so it is regularly under attack from the creatures from the Feydark region. The sidebar in this section talks about factions. Factions are a key element of 5th edition, but you can see that they were also around in 4th edition. This section details 7 different factions that you might want to align your character to, and it has some different loyalties and goals that you might use depending on what faction you join. Then we get into the domains of the Archfey. It essentially means land that belongs to someone. In this case, it's lands that belong to the Archfey. There are 2 such lands described here. The first is Senelise, the land of the Summer Queen, and then the Vale of the Long Night is a land of ice and snow. It has a little bit of a backstory for the Vale of Night in that it was originally ruled by the Summer Prince, but he fell in love with one of the Daughters of Delight and he had his heart broken and it turned into solid ice, and that extended to the entire land. The section on borderlands and wilderness covers some of the more interesting geography that you might encounter in the Feywild. It gives details about the areas known as Brokenstone Vale and Sendrain. I think this is a good place to point out that while this book is focused on player options, there is actually quite a bit in here for dungeon masters that are trying to build a campaign. All these cities and factions and locations are really great seeds to create exciting adventures. So a dungeon master could read through this book and find any number of ideas that they could use as they're creating a campaign or even just a couple of encounters. Isle of Dread could be used if you want to have a more nautical flavor to your character, but it's more about describing the fact that characters who come from the Isle of Dread grew up in a dangerous environment, and so they are hardy folk with a strong will to survive. Next, it talks about the Fomorian cities. These are 3 cities that exist beneath the Feywild and are ruled by evil giants. The 3 cities are Harrowheim, Magterra, and Vortomil. Every one of them is a location that you want to travel into with great care. It is not uncommon for adventurers that are traveling through these areas to be captured and enslaved and forced to fight as gladiators. The Maze of Fathon is a forest labyrinth that is nearly impassable by anyone not from this area. One of the things it points out here is that this area is very safe for the Fae that come from here, and it's unlikely that they would want to leave. So if you have a character that you want to be originating from the Maze of Fathon, you would definitely want to come up with a good reason for why you had left, whether you're seeking adventure or maybe you didn't leave on your own and were taken from there. The Merkendraw is a bleak swamp the size of a sea. It is filled with nasty creatures and inhabitants that are accustomed to living in the most inhospitable conditions. This location is also home to the Muckroot Trade Moot. This is a black market bazaar, so if it shouldn't be sold, it's probably being sold there. And then finally it talks about Noctur, the Goblin Kingdom. This land is nearly as unwelcoming as the Merkendraw. Traveling through this area is not going to be recommended. It's teeming with goblins that will have no issue with ambushing the party and making your day very miserable. The sidebar in this section is a cautionary tale about a small boy who encounters a goblin that promises to grant him whatever he wishes for. The boy uses this as an opportunity to do away with the people in the village that have wronged him, and one by one he wishes that the goblin will vanish everyone in the village until eventually he is all alone. By the end of the story, he is quite upset about this and decides to set out to the Goblin Kingdom to see if he can find out what happened to the villagers. So it's just an interesting bit of flavor that you can use as part of folklore for your character. There's several of these stories scattered throughout this book. And chapter 2, we get into the races of the Fae. While everything that we've talked about so far has been lore and background, the next pages are going to start getting into the more mechanical tools that you can use to build your character. You can use other races such as Eladrin and Drow while you're building a character from the Feywild, but there are 3 new ones offered here as well. As with any race, you will get some benefits when you make your choices. This book provides a lot more detail about each race than what you would get in the player's handbooks. There's actually several pages of information that you can use to round out your character. The first race that we had is the Hamadryad. Much like a Dragonborn is a humanoid dragon, the Hamadryads are humanoid trees. They have oaken vitality that grants them a bonus to endurance. They are all female. One of their cool powers is that they can either force enemies to grant combat advantage or they can grant you resistance to damage. They are usually bound to a tree or even a forest, and they will live as long as that tree or forest is alive, so they are very protective of it. There's some mention of the communities where you'll find Hamadryads. It gives some information about how you could play different classes as a Hamadryad. One thing I really like is the role-playing section. I think it can be difficult to understand the different types of characters that you're creating, especially once you get beyond the core races that people are usually familiar with. So when you get into these more unusual races, it's nice that it provides a little bit of guidance to really help you as you're trying to personify this race. You then get a number of utility powers to choose from in addition to the ones that are provided for your class. The next race that we have is the Pixies. These are tiny creatures with a couple of cool racial powers. First is Pixie Dust that lets an ally fly up to 6 squares, and then Shrink allows you to shrink certain objects so that they can fit a tiny creature. You also have the ability to speak with beasts. If you're role-playing a pixie, you should consider the fact that they tend to be possessive of objects. They view things as a child would view them, and they are braver than they appear. The sidebar points out an interesting trait also, and that is that pixies often travel in the pockets of their larger party members. This can provide an advantage in an encounter where that pixie can stay hidden until they are actually needed. Pixies also get a couple additional utility powers to choose from, such as invisibility and teleportation. And the last race that's offered is the Satyrs. While Hamadryads are all female, Satyrs are all male. They're humans with the legs of a goat and a pair of small horns atop their head. You get to decide how big those horns are. If you're in combat, a Satyr is always going to look for an advantage that they can exploit. They're usually found in forest glades and in grassy areas near rivers. They generally live in clans that could be as small as just 5 or as large as a couple dozen. The image of a satyr bard strumming on a lute is not that uncommon, and they present that in some of the artwork here. They are known for living life to the fullest, making friends whenever possible, and avoiding fights that they don't have an advantage in. For satyr powers, they get Tune of Enchantment, which essentially forces enemies to roll saves with disadvantage, though it's not actually called that in the book. And then Bending the Balance can do either damage or heal depending on how you're going to use it. And then we get into classes. This is the largest section of the book. The classes themselves that are listed here can be found in the player's handbooks, but what it does offer is a new subclass for each one of those races. First, starting with the Barbarian, we get 10 pages of new features and options, including the new subclass, the Berserker. And as we see with subclasses in most edition, what we're getting here is a combination of different classes. So the Berserker is going to use both martial and primal powers and has elements that align with being the role of a defender or a striker. There are 39 new class powers that you can choose from in addition to those available in the player's handbook too. Next is the Bard. This one takes up 15 pages. It offers the optional class feature Signs of Influence, where you get to choose 2 such signs. These are abilities that apply in exploration and social situations. I like the fact that some of these later books are moving away from this focus on combat, and we're actually getting some features that can more directly be applied to other areas of the game. The new Bard subclass is a Skald. It doesn't have access to Bardic training or Bardic virtue, but instead it has Deceptive Duelist and Master of Story and Song. I think it's interesting that the way that they present these features is similar to the format that we would see in 5th edition. They're moving away from the more structured format of powers that we see in 4th edition and providing a more narrative description of what the feature can do. This section provides 50 new powers that you can use for the Bard. That's more than any of the other classes in this book. I've actually never played a Bard in 4th edition, but I think some of these options look pretty cool. Next, we have the Druid. 17 pages of the book. New subclass for it is the Protector. Nature's Growth allows you to create difficult terrain for all creatures other than you. You then get to choose a Druid circle, such as Circle of Renewal or Circle of Shelter. The Primal Attunement feature allows you to control nature around you. One such power that you get is Summon Natural Ally, and the Primordial Guardian Attunement allows you to summon a giant cobra or a desert hawk and other creatures at higher levels. There are 41 additional powers to choose from for the Druid. And then finally, we have the Wizard. This one is 16 pages. We get a new Witch subclass that allows you to charm, transform, and curse enemies. You get a tiny familiar that can travel with you. With the Witch subclass, you get to choose 3 cantrips of your choice. They offer one new cantrip in this book called Chameleon's Mask, and then the others are ones that you would choose out of the player's handbook or maybe Heroes of Fallen Lands. Then you also choose a Moon Coven to get some additional features. Your options here are the Dark Moon Coven and the Full Moon Coven, depending on if you want to be one that practices more sinister magic or one that is more inspirational. And then you get 43 new powers that you can choose from. I went through the list and there are 19 daily powers that you could add to your spellbook along the way. And next we get into character options. The first section of this chapter talks about character themes. I see this as another iteration in the evolution of backgrounds in Dungeons & Dragons. These themes provide a 4th edition background plus some additional features and powers for your character. These are much more detailed than the backgrounds we have in 5th edition, and they actually have more mechanical components tied to them. The first one is the Fey Beast Tamer. This one does not have any prerequisites, but a couple of the others do, so you need to be aware of that. With this theme, you gain one of 4 different companions, and there's a sidebar that tells you the rules for how you would play your companion. There are some features available to you at different levels, and then you get 3 additional powers to choose from as you level up. The other themes have a similar set of enhancements to choose from. A Side Lord must be a half-elf or other race from the Feywild. The Summon Side Ally power is interesting as it summons a guard that shares many of your stats, and you have to spend your actions in order to control it. It's an interesting tool if you need to do something dangerous and you don't want to take the risk yourself. You can summon this ally and then send them into the fray, and they can take all the damage for you. You also have 3 additional powers available with this theme. The Tuathon must be a human or a half-elf. You have the Continue the Story and Shape Changer features that that allow you to roll twice and then choose either result when making certain checks. The Tuathon animal shape allows you to turn into a tiny animal. As I mentioned before, I like the fact that we're seeing powers here that move well beyond combat. The Bargain of Truth power forces a willing creature to speak the truth to you so you can engage in an honest dialogue with them. And the last theme is the Unseelie Agent. It has no prerequisites. The Create Shadow-Wrought weapon allows you to conjure a weapon with extra enhancements for use during an encounter. And then there are 5 additional powers available for this theme. The next section provides Paragon Path features for all of the subclasses that were presented earlier in the book. And the Epic Destinies are not specific to the subclasses in this book, but they do have prerequisites that you need to be aware of. The next section offers 33 new feats. Some of these have prerequisites tied to options available in this book. Page 131 gives us stat blocks for the assorted familiars that you can choose from in this book. The sidebar here provides everything you need to know about using a familiar, most notably that they do not need to eat or breathe, and while you can communicate with your familiar, nobody else can. The Feywild gear section offers 22 new items that are unique to the Feywild. And the magic item section is interesting. First, you get 15 new magic items from the Feywild, but then you get 13 gifts, and this is one of my favorite parts. These are things that the Dungeon Master can use as rewards for completing a quest. You finish a quest for a Fey inhabitant, and they grant you one of these gifts, such as Speak with Animals and Scent of Gold. Each one of them lasts for only 5 levels, and then the magic fades away. And the final section of the book is called Build Your Story. I think this might be my favorite part of the book, if only because it's trying something new and taking a bit of a chance with the tools that it's providing to the players and the Dungeon Masters. In the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are tools that can help a Dungeon Master build a story or create a random dungeon using dice rolls and seeds for different ideas. This chapter is kind of the equivalent of that for a player that's looking to build a character from the Feywild. But it's not just a bunch of random tables, it's actually like you're playing a mini solo adventure to help you determine your character's abilities. The first thing you have to do is choose your ability scores. You can do this by either using the standard array or one of the other methods provided in the player's handbooks. Once you have your ability scores, you don't actually assign them to the abilities, you just have the list of scores, and then you choose your character's upbringing. There are 7 different options available to you. You can either just choose one outright, or you can roll a d12 and let the dice decide for you. Once you decide on an upbringing, it'll tell you what race you would be, or it might give you a couple of options. For example, if you select that you are a Feydark refugee, then you would either be a drow, an eladrin, or a gnome. Next, you will choose what Feywild location you hail from, and then you'll move to that section where you'll complete aptitude tests, which sounds a lot more formal than it really is. When it comes to choosing a location, you can either just select one from the list, or you can roll a d8 and let the dice make the choice for you. Each location has a few options for what you did while you were in this location. So you choose one of those options, and it guides you through assigning one of your ability scores to the indicated ability, and then you have to roll a check. So you assign a value to intelligence, and then you would roll a d20 and add your modifier to see if you succeed at that check. If you succeed, then you move on to the indicated section of the story, and your story continues. If you fail, then you're sent to a different location depending on how much you failed by. For example, if I choose Mithrendain as my location, and I wanted to say that I break into the Citadel Arcanum, I would assign one of my ability scores to Dexterity, and I would roll the check. If I succeed at the check, then I get to join the Watchers of the Night. If I failed with an 18 to a 13, then I escaped capture, but I have to choose a different option. And if I failed with less than 8, then I am captured and banished, and I have to go to the Exiled event page. So there's a lot of different things that can happen depending on how well you do at this check. And all of those dice rolls will eventually lead you to the events section. Here you'll get some additional questions to help you fill in the backstory for your character, and then you're redirected back into the prior pages to continue your journey. For example, if you ended up in the personal tragedy section, you are prompted with questions like, how did you react to the tragedy? Was an individual responsible for this tragedy, or was it an accident? You are then told to roll twice and use either result on your next test that you have to perform. You're then sent back to the civilized lands or to the wilderness locations to continue the process. And you essentially repeat this and slowly build out your character's backstory as you're going. I think some of this might sound a little more complex than it needs to be, but I really love the intent of it. Rather than just forcing players, especially new players, to dig into their imaginations, it provides tools to guide you through the process. You get to play a little solo adventure where you're basically the DM and the player until you craft your character, and at any time you can simply break out of the cycle and fill in the details using your imagination. And when you're done, you have a character not only with all the mechanics, but also with a detailed backstory that you can use while you're adventuring. And finally, at the end of the book, we get the level advancement table that can also be found in the player's handbook. I was a little uncertain when I started going through this book. I'm more about the mechanics than I am about the lore, so the first part of this book was not for me because it's a lot of lore, and I mean a lot of lore. There's a lot of stuff that you can add to your character. If you're somebody that likes lore and likes to include that stuff in your backstory, you will love the first part of this book. But the great thing is that in addition to the lore, there is a ton of mechanical stuff. I love all the new powers and the magic items and the magic gifts and the additional class features and the tool for building a character backstory. I can definitely see how 4th edition was evolving from where it started. A lot of the elements presented here, like the class features and the themes, are things that were not really there early on in 4th edition, but they got further developed and we definitely saw them in 5th edition. Overall, I think it's a wonderful offering and I'm interested in checking out the other 2 books in this series, but let me know what you think. Did you use this book? Did I overlook something that you enjoyed? Let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are, and please share what other 4th edition books you would like me to look at next. Don't forget that I have links where you can pick up a copy of this book for yourself down in the description. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care.